Hi there. Welcome to the Binyanim. It is the unique logic of Hebrew verbs. Hebrew verbs are all about patterns. Although there are exceptions to the rule, knowing the general patterns will help you get the feel of using verb forms as you build your vocabulary through time. Binyanim is a Hebrew word that means buildings. That's how Hebrew speakers refer to the 7 verb stems that serve as structural pillars of verb construction. Each Hebrew verb is formed from a root of 3 letters. The root letters are used to form different kinds of verb types. These verb types are called stems. That's because out of each type stems a unique set of patterns for expressing the infinitive, present tense, past tense, future tense, and imperative form of verbs that belong to a stem. In Hebrew, verb types are generally grouped according to the degree of action and the degree of relationships that they express. The closer the verb stem is towards the center, the more intense are the relationships that they describe. Note that the verb stems colored red concern active efforts, whilst the verb stems colored blue concern passive states. The verb stem in the middle describe actions that involve more intense reciprocal acts, relationships, or intense actions on the self. Let's get to know each verb stem and see examples of a pattern that is specific to each of them. Pual verbs express active efforts that can be done alone by an individual. Here are 2 examples. In the first example, the root letters are
Fe, Tav, Chet.
The Pual rule to form the infinitive form of a word is to add the letter lamed at the start and the letter vav after the first 2 root letters. This forms the Hebrew word that means to open.
Liftoach.
Here's another Pual example. The root letters here are
Samech, Gimel, Reish.
This forms the Hebrew word for the verb to close.
Lisgor.
As you can see in these examples, Pual verbs are active efforts that involve only one person. Now let's look at Nephale verbs. These are the passive counterparts of Pual verbs. These are verbs that involve only one person. However, unlike Pual verbs, the action does not describe a simple effort. But rather, these are verbs often related to circumstances. Let's look at our first Nephale example. Here, the root letters are
Kaf, Shin, Lamed.
The rule for forming the infinitive form of a Nephale verb is to add the prefix lehi before the root. In this case, it forms the verb
Likashel.
This means to fail. Here's another Nephale example. The root letters here are
Mem, Nun, Ain.
This forms the Hebrew word which means to avoid.
Leimana.
As you can see in these examples, Nephale verbs are the passive counterparts of Pual verbs. Nephale verbs are often acts related to circumstances, instead of the active efforts often seen in Pual verbs. But keep in mind that there are exceptions. Some Pual verbs are active actions. Now, let's take a look at Pual verbs. These verbs are intensive active actions. It is closer to the center compared to Pual verbs, so the activity is more intense. Let's see our first PL example. The root letters here are
ד' ב ריש.
The general rule for PL verbs is to add the prefix le before the root letters. In this example, the verb formed is
לדבר.
This is the Hebrew verb, which means to speak. Now let's see another example. Here, the root letters are
צדיק יוד ריש.
By adding the prefix le to the root letters, we get the verb,
לצייר.
which means to paint or to draw. So remember, PL verbs are verbs that describe intensive action. Now let's look at Pual verbs. Pual is the passive counterpart of PL verbs. Pual verbs often describe past participle states or actions done on someone or something. The rule for Pual verbs in the present or participle tense is to add a mem before and a vav in the middle of the root. In our first Pual example, the root letters are
ח' ב ק'.
Now, by applying the rule of adding a mem before the root and inserting a vav in the middle, we form the verb.
מחובק.
That means is hugged. And here's another example. The root letters here are
ות שין למד.
Again, let's apply the rule of adding a mem before the root and a vav in the middle. So we form this word.
מבושל.
That means is cooked. So remember, Pual verbs are past participle forms of passive intensive actions, usually done on something or someone. Now we're getting closer to the center. So we're seeing verbs that are more and more descriptive of actions that involve other persons or things. This is the case of Hephil verbs. Hephil verbs have a notion of an active cause and effect. The general rule to form the infinitive form of a Hephil verb is to add the prefix leha. Let's see our first Hephil example. The root letters here are
זין מם נון סופית.
So let's add the prefix leha to form the verb.
להזמין.
That means to order. In this second example, the root letters are
יוד צדיק ת'.
This forms the verb.
להצית.
That means to ignite. So as you have seen in these examples, Hephil verbs describe actions that actively create a cause and an effect. Now let's see the passive counterpart of Hephil verbs. These are Whofoul verbs. Whilst Hephil verbs describe actions that create a cause, Whofoul verbs describe an effect. So typically, a Hephil verb such as to order will have a Whofoul counterpart, is ordered. The general rule to form the present or participle form of Whofoul verbs is to put a mem and a vav as a prefix to the root. In our first Whofoul example, we have these root letters.
זין מם נון סופית.
So, by applying the Whofoul rule, let's add a mem and a vav before the root. This will form the verb.
מוזמן.
That means is invited. And here's another example. The root letters here are
Kaf, Taf, B.
So again, let's apply the Whofoul rule of adding a mem and a vav before the root. So we form the verb.
מוכתב.
That means is dictated. By this time, you've probably seen how verb stems on opposite ends have a complementary relationship. In the case of Hephil and Whofoul verbs, Hephil is about actions that create a cause, and Whofoul is about seeing the effects of an action. And finally, we've arrived at the central verb stem, Heatpile. Heatpile verbs often speak of reciprocal acts, self-directed acts, or intensely motivated actions. This central verb stem often involves verbs related to very sophisticated concepts. The general rule to have the infinitive form of a heatpile verb is to add the prefix lahit before the root. Our first heatpile example is the Hebrew verb which means to fall in love. The root letters here are
Aleph, He, Vet.
So by adding the prefix lahit to the root, we form the verb.
להתאהב.
That means to fall in love. Our second heatpile example is the Hebrew word for awaken or to wake up. The root letters here are
Ein, Vav, Reish.
So let's apply the heatpile rule of adding the prefix lahit. That will give us the verb.
להתעורר.
That means to awaken or to wake up. So now you know all the verb stems. You have also seen the rules for forming the infinitive forms of these stems, and the present or participle forms of these stems. As you continue to study Hebrew verbs, you will learn how to form the present tense, the future tense, the past tense, and the imperative forms of the different verb stems. You will discover that there are particular patterns to apply when forming the different tenses, and it depends on what verb stem the verb belongs to. By now, you already know the rules for the infinitive and participle tenses that we saw in this video. So you now have a good foundation that will allow you to continue studying the unique logic of Hebrew verbs. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to learn Hebrew in a very visual way, please subscribe to my channel, Hebrew for Beginners. Shalom.